It's a really great pleasure for me to introduce for the first time at a Farry event Victoria Johnson, who is the residentiary canon at Ely Cathedral, and she has a background in science, in biochemistry, worked as a research scientist in Manchester University. She then trained for ordination here at Westcott House and was, I can't remember where you were a curate, Manchester you were a curate and parish priest, and she's thought a lot about science and faith, and she's wanting to, you may have noticed, the first day of the course was very science orientated. Yesterday we had quite a lot more theological input, and today we're kind of trying to earth it in life in the local congregation. So over to you, Vicky. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm relatively new, second time round to Cambridgeshire and Cambridge, so it's good to be back. And to again be immersed in this debate. Just a little bit about my background to put you in some kind of perspective. I trained as a scientist, did a degree and PhD in biochemistry, and then worked as a research associate, or postdoc, that's what you're really called, in a laboratory in Manchester, and that work was funded by Cancer Research UK. My area of work was really cancer cell biology, so I was working at the level of DNA and exploring different proteins which may be involved in cancer progression. And specifically, I was working on cell division and proteins at the kinetochore. Anyone know what that is? No, that's amazing. It is the little bit, let's go back, I'm not going to blind you with science, don't worry. It's the little bit in the middle of the chromosome. So in cell division, that little bit in the middle of the chromosome attaches to spindles which pulls the DNA apart and allows the cell to divide equally. Sometimes that process goes wrong in cancer progression, and here are two pictures of my own from the lab. Of cells. The blue bit is the DNA in the chromosomes, and you can probably just see little bits of chromosomes stuck at the end of the cell. Here, there's a little bit of chromosome stuck in the middle, so this is when cell division has gone wrong, and there's a little bit of DNA left over, so when the cell actually divides, it's unequal, things go wrong, and it could potentially lead to cancer. So that's exactly what I was looking at. I've not used those words in about 10 years, so it's giving me flashbacks. But like I said, in this talk, I'm not trying to blind you with science. My intention today is a little different. So having lived as a Christian and as a scientist, and having contributed to this whole debate in a variety of ways over the years, I suppose I've experienced firsthand some of the challenges and frustrations that arise from these kinds of discussions. For a number of years after ordination, I felt that much of the science and religion debate was rather academic, and I tried to avoid it. So I really played down my scientific background because I didn't want to be part of these discussions. I felt they were way kind of in the academy and not really relevant to what I was actually doing in the parish. I was working in two busy parishes in Manchester as a curate and then as a parish priest. So I did keep up with the debates, but ultimately, as I took funerals and weddings and baptisms and tried to come up with a mission action plan with the PCC, I kept asking myself in relation to the debate on science and religion, so what? I don't know if you felt the same. For a while, to me at least, much of the debate around science and religion seemed quite far removed from my ordinary parish life and our church mission. What I really needed to do was grow the church, make the church relevant and meaningful. I needed to connect to my parish and make sure we paid the parish share. The articles in the media and in the academy, the pronouncements from Richard Dawkins in the press, and the loud-mouthed creationists seemed a long way from where I was, and I confess I was beginning to find them a little tiresome. However, as time went on and I got more and more immersed in parish life and in work for the national church, I began to think more and more about how the church engaged with contemporary culture, how we reached out to people of my own age who had a complete apathy towards Christianity and the church. The science and religion debate kept coming up. Once people knew I had a background in science, they really wanted to have a discussion. They had lots and lots of questions. They were being told one thing. That's genuinely, and that's just off Google, you type in kind of atheist view and you get something like this. It's all over the internet. But that's genuinely what people were perceiving, what they were receiving. They were being told also that to be a Christian meant you had to sacrifice your reason. They were being told that one of the most important scientific theories of the past 200 years was wrong and conflicted with the Christian faith. When I was at university, I went along to the Christian Union and I was told that evolution was evil, and there was some literature at the back for me to read. So this is not a kind of new issue. In a typical conversation at the parent-toddler group, a young mum, not baptised, not confirmed, about my age, new to the church, began to ask me some questions. Vicky, do you think the world was made in 7 days? Vicky, is evolution wrong? Can I come to church if I doubt? Does the church think the Bible is literal? Is everything in the Bible as it says? Is IVF wrong? What do I tell my children? They're not easy questions, but they're questions which were bubbling up, not just from her, but from lots of people in the congregation. And again, over the past 10 years, I've had similar discussions, not with scientists, not with theologians, but with ordinary people exploring their faith, often without the language or tradition to articulate their real concerns. I've found that there is something like a cognitive dissonance between the faith people might want to explore, their spirituality, their yearning for something bigger than themselves, and the conflicting information that they're being fed from atheists and creationists and some scientists and often the church itself. So for me, this is the question that has kept coming up in my ministry. Can you be a Christian and a scientist? Can you be a Christian and believe the claims of science? Here's a real scientist, Francis Collins. He is in some ways one of the fathers of the Human Genome Project, and he is also a practicing Christian. And he is one of those scientists, high-level, academic, producing cutting-edge research, who's spoken into the debate really well. And he has said that there is no conflict between a show-me-the-data scientist and someone who practices the Christian faith. I agree. As well as contributing to this debate at a local and a national level, I've begun to reflect on some general issues, which I hope you don't mind me sharing with you, which might be helpful, moving on from what Ruth said earlier. The first thing it might be worth thinking about is translation. How can we learn to distill and develop ideas and help people understand the relevance of scientific discoveries to life and faith? How can we act as a bridge or become a safe place for people to wonder and ask questions? Can your church communities be that safe place for these kinds of discussions? The second area, which it might be worth reflecting on, is communication. and also connection. Some of you might be aware that jargon is a problem in the church, and it's also a slight problem in science. Recently I was at a meeting of scientists from Cambridge, anthropologists, lawyers, ethicists and me. I don't know why I was there, but we were discussing ethical issues that science was raising at the moment. And the scientists had actually gathered this group together because they felt their research was actually opening up complex ethical issues that they needed help to explore. So this was really exciting. In the course of this discussion, one of the top scientists said, the problem is the scientific community has real issues in communicating clearly to the public. And I said, you should try working for the church. So one of my concerns is, in all of these discussions, is that we don't end up doubly alienating people, the public and our congregations, by our use of strange theological language. The word salvation means almost nothing to an ordinary person on the street. And if you like, using scientific language, which we're not sure of and they're not sure of. So we need to kind of distill and learn about communication. How do we do that? Well, some of it, I think, can be learned. It is a skill. We can keep up with new scientific developments and news stories, particularly in the popular media. There's 2 stories in the newspapers today about developments in Alzheimer's research and also the climate change and the effect it's had on the world that we live in. So perhaps reading the popular press and how science is communicated can give us a way in, particularly if we're not scientists. Also, I think it's important for us to think about what is the science behind the story. As an example, the story this morning about a new potential therapy for Alzheimer's disease. In the article in The Guardian, it says quite clearly that these results were from experiments on mice. How brave are we to actually enter into that deep ethical discussion and talk to people in our congregations about the reality of much medical research? Just a thought. The other thing I think it's important for us to think about is how does this science actually affect people's lives? The Alzheimer's story is obvious. Any new kind of cancer breakthrough is obvious. And when I've done discussions to church groups and to secondary schools, I've often said, how many of you have ever taken an aspirin? How many of you know someone who's had chemotherapy? Lots of hands go up. And this opens up discussion about the actual science that's going on to enable us to live the kinds of lives we want to live. How many of you have got an iPhone or a tablet? And so on and so on. So I think it's important for us to try and distill concepts and avoid jargon. So I apologise for using the word kinetochore earlier in this talk. So really, in terms of how the church communicates, I think this is the task of apologetics. This is how we communicate the faith, and also about how we communicate this debate. The next issue, which I think is important as we go from this course, is to think about context. You know your contexts, what will work in your context. You know your church and your community. You know something of their interests and passions. This kind of work, engaging people in the science and religion debate, is as contextual as any other form of mission. So I'm saying that mission is contextual. We have to see where we are and what's going on and work with God in that place. And to enable people to engage in this discussion, it's also contextual. We need to listen to what's going on. The other thing I think I've already touched on is we need to be aware of the potential pastoral and ethical implications of these discussions and of new discoveries. The young mum who asked me about IVF, there is literature, in the wider Christian church, if you want to say, which makes quite difficult pronouncements about that kind of technology. The church is currently, nationally, engaging in debates on what the media calls three-person mitochondrial IVF. So how we actually start engaging ethically on these discussions really does have an impact at the parish level when you're dealing with people who are exploring difficult issues in their own lives, often through health or medical concerns. I think this is quite important, confidence. I think in our discussions we touched on the fact that actually there is something about the church stepping up to the debate, about Christians stepping up to the debate. I don't think it matters if you don't have a background in science. I think what you really need is enthusiasm, passion, and a willingness to learn. That's more important. Many people are nervous of the word science, and that was rightfully picked up previously. I would say they're even more nervous of the word religion in the current climate, and there are often lots of assumptions that are misplaced on both of those words. So how can we break down some of these urban myths? Can we reclaim reason as part of the Christian discourse? Can we bring in new ethical perspectives into scientific discussions? Like I said, I was invited to talk to top scientists about their work and its ethical implications. That was an amazing privilege. But also, it showed me that at the very highest levels of science, the scientists themselves are raising very difficult ethical problems, which they might need help to discuss. Can we change the landscape of the science and religion debate? I think we shouldn't be afraid of challenging assumptions and stereotypes. When someone says, "Do you believe the earth was made in 7 days?" Well, I don't think that, and I'm still a Christian, and this is why, and engage in that discussion. Perhaps they've asked you for a reason. And I think in my group at the back, we were talking about the fact that people come to these debates and talks and ask a difficult question is actually a way into a further discussion. Best rule of science, experiment. And I think also in mission, in our work in our communities, we have to acknowledge that not everything will work. Some things will be a spectacular failure. When I did talks in the parish, I remember one evening I did a talk about genetics, whether everything about the human being was determined in our genes. And 4 people came, and I was a bit disappointed, but we carried on and had a good discussion. It wasn't a resounding success in terms of numbers. Try new things and new ways of doing things. Think outside the box and don't be afraid of failure. One thing I've also reflected on in the last 10 years is how the church is often very happy to embrace the arts, music, dance, drama, the visual arts. And maybe it's about time, as I think is happening, and I perceive, the church is actually embracing science as well, as a discipline where we can come to know God and communicate who God is. So I think that's quite an important area, that actually how can we embrace science as well, and sometimes use the arts to help progress this discussion. We've had stained glass windows, music, liturgy, visual arts. There's lots we can do there. Again, repeating what Ruth said earlier, none of this is rocket science. I think a lot of it is just common sense and knowing your communities and how you can integrate some of what you've learned from this course into where you are. Finally, I just wanted to offer you some very basic ideas of things that you might take away, and I think some of you have done it before, about how we can bring all of this debate back down to earth and make it real in the places that we're in. One of the things that's always surprised me is how few people have actually been to or led a proper Bible study on the first chapter of Genesis, which is one of the key texts which raises lots of issues. That would be quite a simple thing to do. Preaching, we've talked about this earlier, where appropriate, bringing in ethical and scientific questions into your preaching, but quite rightly not trying to shoehorn science in just for the sake of it. Worship, there is quite a lot of text in the Church of England's common worship, and I know there is in other denominations as well, for something called Creation Tide, which spans harvest but can be extended to include Rogation Tide and Rogation Sunday and Lammas Tide. There's lots of resources already out there that you can work in to a science-themed liturgy. When I was in the parish, in the year I was there, we had an anniversary of Charles Darwin. I think it was the 200th or 250th. So we thought we'd do a liturgy celebrating the life and work of Charles Darwin. We were anticipating some flack, but we didn't get any. So we did a variation of evensong with the usual kinds of obvious music, the heavens are telling the glory of God. We had a speaker come to speak to us from the Society of Ordained Scientists. He did the sermon, the prayers were themed, and actually it was a really great occasion. Lots of people came who don't normally come. So it was definitely a mission event. I've also explored the idea of having a Science Sunday, a little bit kind of ASB, if you know what that is, having a themed Sunday during the year, but it seemed to work quite well, and we made a weekend of it. So on a Saturday we had guided tours around the churchyard looking at nature, counting slugs and insects and butterflies, and on the Sunday having an act of worship with the church decorated with planets and all kinds of stuff happening. So actually really easy stuff, but sometimes it's again just having the confidence to go for it. I think reflecting on the history of the church and science is useful, and remembering that the church was often the cradle of modern experimental science. One of the figures in my field, Gregor Mendel, as you probably know, was an Augustinian monk who kind of gave us the idea that our DNA, he didn't know it was DNA, was inherited from generation to generation. So I think a little bit of research can help us break down some of the myths about scientists of the past and current scientists who are Christian. Lots of other practical ideas. The Eco-Church run by Arosha is being relaunched in January, encouraging congregations to be more environmentally aware and scientifically aware. Lent and Advent courses are an opportunity for learning and development. There's currently a course by Hilary Todd based on the film The Theory of Everything about Stephen Hawking, sort of way in to discuss science. Discussion groups and parish lectures. When I was in the parish, it was just an ordinary suburban parish. I decided, why can't we have a parish lecture once a year and invite someone quite significant to come and speak to us? When I looked through the parish magazines of 200 years ago, they often said, Reverend such and such from London travelled up by coach to do a talk to the ladies group. And I thought, well, actually, we've become, in a way, we've become quite reluctant to invite people in to our parishes. So I thought, right, I'm going to invite some people in. So we had speakers coming, and my philosophy was, if I didn't ask, I wouldn't get. And most people were very happy to come and do a kind of talk to a church group, if you paid their expenses. So some of our lectures and discussion groups were entitled, Can I be a Christian and a Scientist? Do aliens exist? God, Cancer and Suffering. Who's Afraid of Richard Dawkins? All in the Genes. That was my spectacular failure when 4 people turned up. Creation versus Evolution. Some of these seminars drew in people who were not churchgoers, who were not Christians, but who were intrigued by the title. So for the one on Cancer, Suffering and God, we invited the chaplain from the local cancer hospital to come and talk to us about his work. and there were 100 people in the church on a Friday night thinking about the ethics and the real difficulties of living with cancer. So being brave enough to host this kind of event in a church can be a really good thing. Lots of churches often host hustings for elections, and this could be a similar kind of thing. We're creating a safe space for people to think and ask questions. In the parish, I kept saying to people, questions are fine. It's when you don't ask questions that I begin to worry. Other things, trips out, trips to local observatories, talks by local scientists, inviting charities in. Churches are often a big funder of medical research charities, holding coffee mornings for cancer research and the British Heart Foundation. Why not ask someone to come in from those charities and talk to you? Importantly, supporting local scientists in your congregation. The Church of England is currently trying to encourage supporting scientists who are in your congregations, not just academic scientists, but nurses, doctors, teachers, engineers, chemists, biologists, anyone who works in the scientific or associated industries, and perhaps encouraging them to tell their stories. We talk quite a lot about schools work. Quite often in a church setting, the vicar or minister is asked to be a governor. And I wonder, could we be brave enough to be the link governor for science rather than RE? Just a thought. Why not talk to teachers and see if they can bring other aspects of the curriculum into their visit to the church? So instead of just looking at the church vestments, maybe we could explore the geology of the stone that was used to build the church and where it came from. I think it's always thinking out the box, thinking of new ideas. And finally, I've already touched on it, I think there is something that often gets a little bit lost, is the serious pastoral issues that these debates often raise. Medical procedures, drugs, genetic testing, cancer research, genetically modified food and crops, they're all issues which are right there in our faces, and they might be carefully handled a way in to explore this subject. I think finally what I want to say is, I think an important part of what we might do is actually listen to what questions people are asking in our congregations, and also listen to what people are asking on the street. So our series of seminars, Do Aliens Exist? It was more of an exercise in listening to where people's questions were and trying to respond to them, and being able to open up discussions. And I think that's quite important. What are people asking? When you go back to your communities, what are the questions that people have that you might be able to begin a discussion about? So don't be afraid to ask questions, that's what I would say. Don't be afraid to talk about science and the contemporary issues that are arising day by day. Don't be afraid to explore, question, research and ask advice. Ask for help, ask for people to come in and support you. Acknowledge that there are ethical implications which we should not ignore and we should take great care about. And as I think is probably run through this whole course, give thanks for the discoveries of science which we can take advantage of. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Vicky. That was incredibly practical, and I think it'll be very useful. We're going to just take questions from the floor now, and then we're going to go into groups a bit later on for the last section of the morning. So, are there questions or comments, particularly questions of drawing on Vicky's experience that you'd like to pose? Okay, there's one at the back and then I'll come forward.
You mentioned doing a yearly lecture which I thought was a really good idea. Did you ever think about doing a series, so a science and faith series, and did you ever try it, and if so, how did it go?
The little series of evening lectures I was talking about, we had one big lecture a year, and we also had a series of small lectures. I called it Friday Night Theology, and I thought I couldn't think of a more boring title, but under that umbrella we had all these other things. Do aliens exist? We mixed it up a bit so it wasn't all completely science-based, but because of my background and the context I had, it inevitably, it sort of went that way. But I think if you did a sort of evening lecture sermon sort of series or lecture series, that would be fantastic. Sermon series are also a good idea, especially if you have an evening service in your parish. Sometimes you can be looking for a theme for that kind of setting, but having a sermon series is also a good idea. So yeah, I think it would work really well. You can only try.
There was a question. Charlotte had a question, a comment.
It's just picking up on that, Vicky, really, and the context of your church. You did it in the church building, not in the church hall. Do you have sort of hospitality and bookstalls, and how do you dress it up?
That's a really good question. We dressed it up really badly. We had a church hall which was about as big as a sort of box room. So we couldn't do it. The first one we did in the church hall, and it was so packed, we had to go back into the church. So we didn't have, an amazingly flash church hall we could use. So in the end, we did it all in the church. When people arrived, we gave them some sherry.
I don't think that's badly at all.
Same Church of England. And some orange juice and nibbles to try and soften up any difficult questions we might get. So it was really basic. But what we did do is we did publicise it, especially some of the talks which we felt had a wider appeal to the general public. We'd stick posters up in all the shops, and we'd put it on the internet, and we'd contact other groups. So it was really, like I said, it was certainly not rocket science. It wasn't high-level stuff. It was sherry and nibbles, and a good question to get debate going. But that format, you can kind of expand and adapt to different contexts. So now I'm in a cathedral. It's like, excellent. We can make it... we can do kind of wine, not sherry. We can have posh crisps, not Wotsits. So it's actually very straightforward, I think. Just stick a poster up and get going.
Thank you. Other questions? Mike?
Just finding the right sort of title for it. The local Methodists and Anglicans near where I live, they're running one which is called, I think, Beer and Philosophy.
Yeah.
And it's run in the local pub.
That's a brilliant idea. We did have a pub next door, but we usually went there afterwards. The idea was we had the talk, and then we'd often say we're going to carry on the discussion in the pub. So that kind of stuff is very easy to organise. It can be quite fun as well.
Yes?
Most students in the country give up science at the earliest possible opportunity, usually by about 16. So when they get to early 20s or a bit further on, they've forgotten most of the science, as they didn't want to do it anyway. So how do you bring them up to speed with some of these really technically demanding subject areas?
If I may say, I think they're more up to speed with science than they are with religion. I think the culture of science is, despite what the scientists say, better communicated. So in terms of, if they've done science up to 16, they're probably pretty advanced in what they know. But they've probably given up religion at 10. So it's actually what subject are we bringing up to the level? In the discussions I've had with primary children and secondary age children, actually the harder task is talking as a Christian without using lots of Christian jargon and being able to communicate that side of it. So that's just my perspective. I could be wrong, but I'm more worried about the religious inarticulation.
Okay, I'd like to throw out a little conundrum which has come up over the course of a couple of times, and I think it was Trevor who said when you did your day, you actually found it was dads and daughters that or dads and kids that came, and it seemed to attract the men. And then you had a comment from Jason decrying the fact that so many, there was a lack of women represented in the scientific professions, which is something that is hopefully changing. I hoped to get her to come here, had a conversation earlier last year with a Westcott student who was on this course last year and who went away and did something in Westcott, and she said some sort of a Federation worship type thing in Westcott House, and she said that the people that really appreciated that were the guys, and they really sort of warmed to it. And so there seems to be this, the sense that perhaps science is a bit gendered, which is a bad thing, but on the other hand, there is the problem, of course, that of lack of men in the church, and if science attracts the men more than other things, is that a good thing? So I think there's a little bit of a tension there. I don't know if you've got any comments about that, on what your experience is.
I could say quite a lot on that subject, actually.
Go on then.
I won't say too much. I think to say science is a bit gendered is an understatement. I think to say the church is a bit gendered is also an understatement. All the debates, I've been involved in this field for a while, and often when I go to discussions, science and religion discussions, they are, if I may say, older, male orientated. I don't know if that's a misperception.
No, it's entirely accurate.
And I'm not naive enough to think that I haven't been invited to preach in some amazing places since being back in Cambridgeshire, because I'm a woman preacher who also has a background in science. So it's helpful to have a woman speaker in this subject. So there's definitely something to explore. I think my experience in terms of bringing people into the life of the church, I think it was a bit more nuanced than lots of men coming into the church. But I think it shows really that the church is open to engaging in the stuff of life, whatever that may be. So there's probably a PhD in there if anyone wants to do one.
Yes, I think you're probably right. I think you're probably right, thank you. I mean, it does seem to suggest that in terms of mission, engaging with science is actually could potentially be part of the answer to a problem.
Yes.
In the 21st century church.
And if I could just add, Ruth did mention it, the Church of England has currently setting up a project of 3 years to engage congregations in science, and information about the grants should be up on the Church of England website quite soon. And I think from my experience, generally, regardless of male or female, it's an important missionary issue for the church to address in the age that we live in. And if we don't address it, and if we don't talk about it, more and more people will think that our faith is irrelevant. So I think that's the crux of it for me, that debate.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, are there other comments, questions, observations? Okay, late comer there.
I think one of the things that a lot of people worry about when it comes to church, particularly with regard to church and science, is that there is a sense that sort of religion holds progress back. I was interested in what you were saying about ethics, and I think there's a big sort of missionary responsibility that we have as a church in offering our opinion on ethical issues. But I wonder if there's a tension there, particularly with things, you mentioned IVF. If you have some people in the parish who have been trying for a long time to have babies, and then they come to you as a priest, and the church hasn't yet fully figured out what it thinks about IVF. How do you do that without putting people in church completely?
I think that's a question for everyone in ministry. The church might not have a position, but you as a kind of practitioner and theological thinker and priest and pastor, I think this is where we have to do some of the formulation ourselves. Because you're right, some of these issues at the very cutting edge of science, the church quite rightly is saying we need some caution. And usually if you read the church's response in detail, they're often on that line. We think this is, they're not doubting the science or the progress, but they say, actually, our concern is with some of the ethics that this will bring. So I think you're right, but I think when you're sat face to face with someone asking you these questions, which I have been and which I'm sure you have been, I think that's when I become the priest and not the scientist, if you like. But I think that's where it really hits the road, and you'll all have these questions as science progresses. Save your siblings, GM crops, which we're all probably eating without knowing it. But then you read the Daily Mail as if it's a kind of new thing. Well, we've been eating them for quite a while. So it's kind of how do we as individuals also bring all this together for that one encounter with someone who's in real need.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Okay. I know, do you want to just say something about that paper that I put on the Moodle platform?
Yes. On Moodle there's a paper which is actually quite old now, but it was a diocesan synod motion for General Synod, which was discussed, I think now 10 years ago at General Synod, and now it seems to me the fruition of some of this debate is actually feeding through into the life of the church. The debate was called the compatibility of science and Christian belief. You can look up the paper on the General Synod back notes, but there is a copy of it on Moodle for you to read. So it rehearses some of the arguments that were discussed at General Synod in the Church of England. And at the end, like every synod motion, if you're a fan, it says something like, in responding to the motion, we invite synod members to consider the following questions for practical outworking of this debate. How the Church of England can continue to promote and affirm the compatibility of the Christian faith and science at a parish, diocesan and national level. And then it goes on to raise other questions. So in terms of, if you like, the national church, the debate has happened, and I think now the national church is very keen to let it filter through into the whole life of the church, which I think is great. So that paper is on Moodle, and also finally, if I can give a plug to the Science Festival that I'm currently planning at Ely Cathedral, hopefully for 2017. Again, taking lots of ideas, arts, music, science lectures, and putting them all together in a week long of activities. Part of the idea of that festival is because in a cathedral context we have resources and the clout to do this. We might inspire parishes and local congregations to take ideas away. So watch that space.
Thanks very much. And those of you that are still around in the Cambridge area in 2017, be sure to go along.
Or come and help.
Yes, come and help. Okay, let's thank Vicky very much indeed for